Torsten Lindgren knelt in the blinding snow, staring down into the rectangular pit where 4 wolves lay motionless at the bottom, their bodies still warm. They had vanished without a sound, falling through what appeared to be solid ground, and the technique that made it possible would change wolf control across the Northern Territories for the next 40 years. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable frontier survival innovation. The winter of 1859 came to the Montana Territory with a cruelty that old-timers would remember for decades. February brought temperatures that split trees open and winds that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. Torsten Lindgren and his partner, Rufus Merrick, had established their trapping camp in a narrow valley along the Bitterroot Range, far enough from established settlements to avoid competition, close enough to tributaries rich with beaver. They had survived 3 winters together, building a partnership based on complementary skills and mutual respect. Torsten handled the technical aspects of trap construction and placement. Rufus managed the physical labor and had an uncanny ability to read weather patterns. Together, they had created a profitable operation in one of the harshest environments on the frontier. The wolves had appeared in late January. It started with distant howling at night, echoing off the valley walls. Then they found tracks near their trap lines. Within a week, the pack had destroyed 3 beaver sets and stolen 2 lynx carcasses Torsten had left to skin the following day. The wolves were testing them, learning their patterns, growing bolder with each passing night. Torsten and Rufus discussed their options around the fire. They could abandon the valley and lose an entire season's positioning, or they could stand their ground and find a way to eliminate the threat. They chose to stay. On February 14, 1859, Rufus left the cabin just after dawn to check their northern trap line. It was a routine he had performed hundreds of times. The morning was clear and cold, with fresh snow from the previous night covering the landscape in pristine white. Torsten stayed at the cabin to process pelts from the previous day's haul, working methodically at the scraping bench they had built against the south wall. Around mid-morning, he heard sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Screaming, raw, terrified screaming that cut through the morning silence and then stopped abruptly. Torsten grabbed his rifle and ran toward the sound. His boots broke through the snow crust with each stride, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He found Rufus a quarter-mile from camp, near a frozen creek where they had placed several beaver traps. The wolves had attacked him from multiple directions while he was bent over checking a set. Rufus had managed to fire one shot, but it had gone wide. The pack had killed him with brutal efficiency. Torsten stood over his partner's body, rifle ready, but the wolves were gone. Only tracks remained, a confusion of prints in the blood-stained snow, showing where at least 5 animals had converged on one man. He wrapped Rufus in canvas and dragged him back to camp. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took Torsten 6 hours to chip out a grave on a hillside overlooking the valley. He buried Rufus as the sun set, marking the spot with stones he had heated by the fire to free them from frozen earth. That night, Torsten sat in the cabin unable to sleep, listening to wolves howling in the distance. They were celebrating. Torsten spent the week after Rufus's death setting every trap he knew. He had 14 steel leg traps, each weighing 8 pounds and capable of breaking a wolf's leg with enough force to hold the animal until he could arrive with his rifle. He set them along the trails where he had found wolf tracks, disguising them under light snow cover and using beaver castor to mask his scent. Within 3 days, the temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The steel traps froze solid. The trigger mechanisms became locked in place, immovable. Snow drifted over them, and even if a wolf had stepped directly on one, the trap would not have functioned. He tried poison next. He laced deer meat with strychnine, purchased the previous fall from a trading post on the Clark Fork River. The poison was expensive and supposedly effective. He placed the baited meat at 4 locations around his territory, positioning them where wolf tracks were heaviest. The wolves ignored every piece. They walked past the poisoned meat, sometimes within feet of it, and continued on their routes. Torsten realized they could smell the poison or had learned from other encounters that human-scented food meant danger. He attempted to hunt them directly. For 5 days, he tracked the pack, following their prints through the forest, trying to position himself for a clear shot. The wolves were too intelligent. They traveled in terrain that offered no clean sight lines. When he got close, they scattered and reformed a mile away. When he tried to anticipate their route and set up an ambush, they changed direction. He managed 1 shot on the 6th day, hitting a smaller wolf in the hind quarter. The animal yelped and ran, and the pack vanished into thick timber. He tracked the blood trail for 2 miles before losing it in rocky terrain. Klaus Bachmann visited during the 3rd week of February. He operated a trap line 15 miles to the east and had heard about Rufus's death through the loose network of trappers scattered across the territory. Klaus was a practical man who had survived 12 winters in the mountains. He looked at Torsten's failed trap sets and shook his head. "You accept the losses and move on," Klaus said in his thick German accent. "Wolves are part of the mountains. You cannot eliminate them. You work around them." Elkanah Stowe came by 2 days later, riding through fresh snow to check on Torsten. Elkanah ran a small trading post on the Blackfoot River and made winter rounds to isolated trappers. He was a religious man who saw hardship as divine testing. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away," Elkanah said, standing in Torsten's cabin. "Your partner is gone. These wolves will move on eventually. Patience is the virtue asked of us." But the wolves did not move on. They killed one of Torsten's 2 mules on February 23rd. They destroyed another trap line on February 26th. At night, Torsten could hear them circling the cabin, testing his defenses, learning his weaknesses. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that every method he had tried had failed completely. The storm that arrived on March 1st brought snow that fell without pause for 4 days. Torsten watched it accumulate from his cabin window, measuring the depth against a marked post he had driven into the ground the previous autumn. 6 inches the first day, 12 by the second morning, 18 inches by the 3rd evening. The snow transformed the landscape, softening every hard edge, filling every depression, creating a world of smooth white curves where rough terrain had existed before. On the 4th day, Torsten ventured out to check his remaining functional trap sets. He crossed a narrow creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property, a stream perhaps 4 feet wide that normally flowed over rocks and around boulders. The snow had bridged it completely. What appeared to be solid ground was actually a thin layer of snow spanning empty space. Torsten noticed this and stopped. He found a fallen branch and poked at the snow bridge. It held under the light pressure. He pushed harder, and the surface remained intact. He placed the branch across the snow horizontally and applied his weight gradually. The bridge supported him for 3 seconds, then collapsed suddenly, dumping him hip-deep into the icy water below. He climbed out, soaked and freezing, and returned to the cabin to change clothes. But his mind remained fixed on what had just happened. The snow had created a false surface that appeared solid, but was not. It had supported weight up to a specific threshold, then failed completely. That evening, as he dried his clothes by the fire, he began experimenting. He went back outside and found other places where snow had bridged gaps, small depressions between rocks, spaces between fallen logs. Each time, he tested the load-bearing capacity using branches of increasing weight. The pattern became clear. Fresh snow, when it accumulated across an open space, formed a bridge through a combination of crystal interlocking and cold fusion. The bridge appeared identical to solid ground beneath it. It could support significant weight initially, but that support decreased as the weight increased or as the same spot was stressed repeatedly. The failure, when it came, was sudden and complete. Torsten returned to the cabin and stared at the fire. His mind worked through possibilities. A wolf weighed between 70 and 100 pounds. A snow bridge thick enough to appear solid, but weak enough to collapse under that weight, would need to be engineered precisely. Too thick, and it would hold indefinitely. Too thin, and it would appear obviously fragile. But at the correct thickness, it would create a trap that was invisible. He remembered a story Anders, his older brother, had told him years before in Sweden. Hunters in the North Country sometimes dug pits to catch elk. They covered the pits with branches and moss, creating false ground that collapsed when the animals stepped on it. Anders had died of fever before they emigrated, but his stories had survived. Torsten stood and found a piece of charcoal from the bar. He began sketching on the cabin wall, drawing plans for something that did not yet exist but might solve an impossible problem. Torsten began digging on March 7, 1859. He chose a location 200 yards from his cabin, along a ridge where wolf tracks appeared with consistent regularity. The pack used this route to move between the valley floor and higher timber. The ground there was relatively flat, surrounded by sparse pine trees that would not interfere with snow accumulation patterns. It was the perfect killing ground if he could make the earth itself betray the animals that crossed it. The first challenge was the frost line. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of 18 inches. A pickaxe bounced off the surface, barely chipping the iron-hard soil. Torsten needed a different approach. He built fires directly on the spots where he intended to dig, letting them burn for 6 hours until the ground beneath thawed enough to work. Then he would excavate the softened earth quickly before it refroze, remove it, and start another fire to thaw the next layer deeper. The process was exhausting and slow. He worked from dawn until dark, burning through his firewood supply at an alarming rate. Klaus Bachmann rode past on March 10th and stopped to watch Torsten working in the rectangular hole that was now 3 feet deep. Klaus sat on his horse, shaking his head slowly. "You are digging your own grave, friend," Klaus said. "This madness will kill you before the wolves do." Torsten did not stop working. He threw another shovel full of earth onto the growing pile beside the pit. "What is this supposed to accomplish?" Klaus asked. "It will catch them," Torsten said. "A hole catches nothing. A hole is where you put things that are already dead." Klaus turned his horse and rode away without another word. Elkanah Stowe appeared on March 14th. The pit was now 5 feet deep, and Torsten was working at the bottom, his head barely visible above ground level. Elkanah stood at the edge, looking down with genuine concern on his weathered face. "Torsten, men go mad in winter isolation," Elkanah said carefully. "I have seen it before. The mind turns inward and creates obsessions. You need to leave this place for a while. Come to the trading post. Be around people." Torsten climbed out of the pit, breathing hard. His hands were blistered despite the gloves he wore. His back ached from the repetitive motion of digging and lifting. "I am not mad," Torsten said quietly. "I am solving a problem." "By digging a hole in frozen ground during a blizzard?" Elkanah's voice carried more pity than judgment. "Yes." Elkanah left, promising to check on him again in 2 weeks. Torsten returned to the pit. By March 18th, it measured 6 feet deep, 5 feet square, with walls that were almost perfectly vertical. He had removed over a ton of frozen earth. His body was exhausted, but the foundation of his solution was complete. Now came the part that would require precision rather than strength. Now came the engineering that would make the invisible trap function. The pit was complete, but it was only a hole in the ground. Torsten needed to transform it into something that would appear to be solid terrain while remaining lethally fragile. The camouflage had to be perfect because wolves possessed senses far superior to humans. They could detect temperature differences in snow, identify disturbed earth by scent, and recognize unnatural patterns from considerable distances. Any obvious construction would cause them to avoid the area entirely. Torsten spent 2 days cutting poles from young pine trees. He needed them straight, uniform in diameter, and strong enough to support initial weight without being so robust they would not break when stressed. He selected trees between 2 and 3 inches thick, cutting them into lengths that would span the 5-foot width of the pit with 6 inches of overlap on each side. He stripped the bark completely, knowing that bark held scent, and created irregular surfaces that might be visible through snow. He laid the poles across the pit opening, spacing them 4 inches apart. The result was a lattice framework that could support light weight distributed across its surface, but would fail if concentrated pressure was applied at any single point. He tested it by placing a log weighing approximately 30 pounds in the center. The lattice held. He added another log, still stable. When he placed a third log, bringing the total weight to roughly 90 pounds concentrated in one spot, he heard cracking sounds. The poles were beginning to stress. The next challenge was creating a snow surface that would blend seamlessly with the surrounding terrain. Torsten waited for fresh snowfall, which came on March 22nd. As snow accumulated, he carefully gathered it and packed it onto the pole lattice in layers. The first layer was 3 inches of tightly packed snow that filled the gaps between poles and created a relatively solid base. Over this, he added 2 inches of loose, unpacked snow that matched the texture of natural accumulation. The result looked promising, but something was wrong. The snow surface appeared too uniform, too smooth. Natural snow in a forest environment was textured by falling pine needles, small debris, and slight irregularities in accumulation patterns. Torsten gathered pine needles and small twigs, scattering them across the camouflaged surface. He studied it from 20 feet away, then 50 feet, then from the perspective a wolf would have approaching along the ridge trail. It looked natural. It looked like every other square foot of snow-covered ground in the area. But would it hold long enough for a wolf to commit its full weight before collapsing? On March 24th, the storm intensified again. Fresh snow fell throughout the day, adding another 3 inches to the landscape. Torsten watched from his cabin as the new snow covered his construction completely, erasing even the subtle differences he had worried about. By evening, the pit was invisible. He walked to within 10 feet of it and could not determine its location without referencing the trees he had marked as guides. The trap was ready. Now everything depended on whether the wolves would use their established route and whether the engineering would function as he had calculated. Torsten watched from his cabin window as dawn broke on March 25th. The trap had been completed for 1 full day, and nothing had happened. He knew intellectually that patience was required, that wolves traveled on their own schedule and would not conveniently appear simply because he had prepared for them. But knowing this did not ease the gnawing doubt that had kept him awake most of the night. 2 weeks of back-breaking labor had gone into creating something that might accomplish nothing. He spent the morning checking his remaining functional trap lines, finding 2 beaver and 1 marten. The work was mechanical, requiring no thought, which allowed his mind to circle endlessly around the same questions. Had he positioned the pit correctly? Was the snow bridge too thick, too thin? Would wolves detect something wrong with the surface and avoid it? The uncertainty was worse than the physical exhaustion had been. On March 27th, Elkanah returned as promised. He brought supplies, coffee, salt, and news from other trappers scattered across the territory. The wolves that had killed Rufus had been seen 15 miles to the south, attacking a settler's livestock. The information hit Torsten like a physical blow. If the pack had moved on, his trap would catch nothing. All the effort would be wasted. "You should come back with me," Elkanah said, standing in the cabin doorway. "There is work at the trading post, honest work. You can leave this obsession behind." Torsten declined politely. After Elkanah left, he sat alone, staring at the drawings on his cabin wall, wondering if Klaus had been right. Maybe he was, digging his own grave, not literally but spiritually, burying himself in a futile project while life moved forward elsewhere. Klaus appeared on March 30th, riding past without stopping, but calling out from a distance. "Still waiting for your magic hole to work, Lindgren?" Torsten did not respond. He watched Klaus disappear down the valley trail, heading toward more productive endeavors. The nights were the hardest. Torsten lay in his bunk, listening to the wind moving through the pines, hearing every sound and trying to interpret it. Was that a wolf howling, or just wind through a particular rock formation? Were those footsteps outside, or branches dropping snow loads? The isolation that had never bothered him during 3 winters with Rufus now felt oppressive. On April 2nd, he checked the trap site in early morning light. Wolf tracks approached from the north, multiple animals moving along the ridge trail exactly as he had predicted. The tracks came within 30 feet of the pit, then stopped abruptly. The snow surface showed where the lead wolf had paused, perhaps sensing something wrong, perhaps simply cautious by nature. The tracks veered east, avoiding the area entirely, continuing along an alternate route that bypassed his trap completely. Torsten stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks. The wolves had detected something. His construction had failed before it had a chance to prove itself. He walked back to the cabin, questions without answers, following him through the snow. The night of April 5th began like the previous 12 nights. Torsten lay in his bunk, listening to familiar sounds, the wind in the pines, snow sliding off the cabin roof, the settling creaks of logs contracting in the cold. Around 10 o'clock he heard wolves howling, a sound that had become routine over the past weeks. The pack was close, perhaps a half-mile away, based on the clarity of the vocalizations. He counted at least 4 distinct voices in the chorus. They howled for perhaps 15 minutes, then fell silent. Torsten eventually drifted into uneasy sleep. He woke sometime after midnight to absolute quiet. The wind had stopped. No wolves howled, no branches creaked. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, almost oppressive. He lay there in the darkness, listening to nothing, and felt a strange unease he could not name. Something had changed, but he did not know what. Morning came clear and cold. Torsten dressed, started the fire, and made coffee from grounds he had used twice already. He went through the motions of beginning another day, trying not to think about the trap that had now sat unused for 9 days. Around 8 o'clock, he decided to check the site one more time. If the wolves had avoided it again, he would dismantle the construction and admit defeat. He walked the 200 yards to the ridge, approaching from the west as he always did to avoid leaving tracks near the trap itself. From 50 feet away, everything looked normal. Snow-covered ground, scattered pines, the same landscape he had seen yesterday. But as he got closer, he noticed something wrong with the surface texture near his marked trees. The snow there appeared disturbed, broken, different from the smooth accumulation surrounding it. Torsten approached carefully, his heart beginning to beat faster. The pit opening was partially exposed. The snow bridge had collapsed. Poles stuck up at odd angles where the lattice framework had broken. He moved to the edge and looked down. 4 wolves lay at the bottom, their bodies motionless, limbs at unnatural angles. They had fallen 6 feet onto frozen earth, and the impact had killed them. No blood marked the snow. No signs of struggle showed in the pit walls. They had simply fallen through what appeared to be solid ground and died from the fall itself, or from injuries that rendered them unable to escape. Torsten's hands began to shake, not from cold, but from the realization of what he was seeing. The wolves had vanished silently in the night, making no sounds that carried to his cabin. The pack's howling had stopped abruptly because 4 members had suddenly disappeared, falling through the earth without warning. The remaining pack members would have no idea what happened, only that their companions were gone. He knelt in the snow, staring down at the proof his engineering had worked. The impossible had become real. The trap had functioned exactly as he had calculated, and the silence of its success was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of all. Torsten spent the rest of that morning examining every aspect of what had occurred. He needed to understand not just that the trap had worked, but precisely why it had worked and whether the success was repeatable or merely fortunate accident. He circled the pit, studying the wolf tracks in the snow, reading the story they told about the final moments before the animals fell. The tracks approached from the north, along the ridge trail he had predicted they would use. 4 sets of prints, ranging in size from large to medium, indicated a hunting party or patrol group moving through their territory. The lead wolf, based on track size and positioning, had crossed the snow bridge first. Its prints showed a normal gait and stride length right up to the edge where the surface had collapsed. There was no hesitation, no indication the animal had sensed danger. The other 3 wolves had followed within seconds. Their tracks overlapped near the failure point, suggesting they were traveling close together, perhaps investigating something the lead wolf had detected or simply following their established route. The snow bridge had held under the first wolf's weight for the brief moment it took that animal to commit fully. Then the weakened structure had given way catastrophically, collapsing under the combined weight of multiple animals in rapid succession. Torsten examined the broken poles. They had fractured at predictable stress points, exactly where he had calculated maximum load would concentrate. The pole spacing and the snow layering had created a surface that appeared solid enough to trust, but was actually on the verge of failure. The engineering had worked precisely as designed. He climbed down into the pit using a rope. The wolves had died from the fall itself, their necks broken or their skulls fractured against the hard earth bottom. The 6-foot depth was sufficient to cause lethal impact. The vertical walls prevented any possibility of escape, even if an animal had survived the initial fall. One wolf showed scrape marks on its claws where it had apparently tried to climb out before dying, but the smooth dirt walls offered no purchase. The most significant discovery was the complete absence of warning. The pit had aired out during the 9 days since construction. No human scent lingered to alert the wolves. The snow bridge appeared identical to surrounding terrain. The poles were hidden completely beneath the snow layers. There were no mechanical components to freeze, no triggers to fail, no bait to be ignored. The trap was purely gravitational and deceptive. It weaponized the landscape itself. Torsten climbed back out and sat at the edge, his mind working through implications. This was not a single success story. This was a repeatable technique. Any trapper with basic tools could dig a pit, construct a pole framework, and engineer a collapsing snow surface. The method required time and labor, but it worked with absolute reliability if executed correctly. The wolves' intelligence, which had allowed them to avoid every conventional trap, had been irrelevant. They could not detect a danger that left no detectable traces. Alistair Munro arrived at Torsten's cabin on April 20th, riding a horse that looked exhausted from hard travel. Alistair was a Scottish trapper who had established a small ranch operation 40 miles to the northwest, running sheep in addition to trapping beaver during winter months. Torsten knew him slightly from previous encounters at Elkanah's trading post, but had never worked with him directly. "I lost 18 sheep in the past 2 weeks," Alistair said without preamble, standing in Torsten's doorway. "Wolves, they come at night. Kill more than they eat, leave the carcasses scattered. I have tried everything. Steel traps, poison, hunting. Nothing works. Elkanah told me you killed 4 wolves with some kind of pit trap. I need to know how." Torsten invited him inside and explained the technique over coffee. He described the excavation process, the pole framework, the snow engineering, and the physics that made the camouflage work. Alistair listened without interrupting, his weathered face showing skepticism that gradually shifted to interest. "You are saying the wolves walk over what looks like ground, and they simply fall through?" Alistair asked. "Yes. If the snow bridge is engineered correctly, they cannot detect it. There is no scent, no visual warning, no sound until they are already falling." "Show me." They rode to Alistair's ranch, arriving on April 23rd. Torsten identified 3 locations where wolf tracks showed consistent travel patterns. They selected the most promising site and began digging. The work took 6 days. Alistair was strong and experienced with excavation from years of ranch work, but even with 2 men, the process was exhausting. They dug through partially thawed ground, built the pole framework exactly as Torsten specified, and waited for fresh snow to complete the camouflage. Klaus Bachmann rode past on the 5th day and stopped to watch them working. He looked at the rectangular pit, then at Torsten, then at Alistair. "Now there are 2 madmen digging graves," Klaus said. "This foolishness is contagious." Elkanah appeared on the 6th day, bringing supplies and his usual concern. He stood at the edge of the completed pit, shaking his head slowly. "I hope you both know what you are doing," Elkanah said. "This seems like considerable effort for uncertain results." 3 days after they finished construction, Alistair rode to Torsten's cabin before dawn. His face showed exhaustion, but also something else: vindication. "2 wolves," Alistair said simply. "Dead at the bottom. I checked this morning. They fell through during the night. No sound, no warning, just gone." Word spread through the scattered trapping community with surprising speed. By late May, 5 trappers had visited Torsten asking about the technique. He explained it freely to anyone who asked, sharing every detail of construction and snow engineering. He sought no payment, no recognition, just the spread of knowledge that solved a genuine problem. By June, when the snow finally melted completely and trapping season ended, 7 pits existed across the northern Montana territory. Trappers began calling them Lindgren pits, though Torsten never used that name himself. Torsten left the Montana territory in the spring of 1862. The fur trade that had sustained mountain men for 3 decades was collapsing under the combined pressures of depleted beaver populations and changing fashion trends in eastern cities. Silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the market that had driven thousands of men into the wilderness. Trappers were abandoning their camps, heading to new gold strikes in Idaho, settling as ranchers, or simply returning to civilization after years in the mountains. Torsten sold his remaining equipment to Elkanah and used the money to purchase passage west to the Oregon Territory. He had saved enough during his trapping years to buy land in the Willamette Valley, where former mountain men were establishing farms and integrating into settled society. He built a small house, planted crops, and began a life that bore no resemblance to his years in the wilderness. He married in 1864 a widow named Catherine, who had come west with a wagon train. They had 3 children over the next 8 years, 2 daughters and a son. Torsten became known in his community as a reliable farmer and occasional carpenter. He attended church, participated in community barn raisings, and lived quietly. He never spoke about his time in the mountains unless directly asked, and even then his answers were brief and factual. When people learned he had been a trapper, they sometimes asked about adventures with grizzly bears or hostile encounters with Indians. Torsten would disappoint them with stories about beaver dam construction and the economics of fur trading. He never mentioned Rufus Merrick's death. He never described the wolf pit or the engineering that had gone into its construction. Those memories belonged to a different person in a different life. Torsten died in December of 1881 at age 59 from pneumonia, contracted during a particularly harsh winter. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone identified him as a farmer and family man. There was no mention of the Montana Territory, no reference to trapping or wolves or innovations that had saved lives. But in the mountains he had left behind, the technique survived. Trappers continued building snow pits through the 1870s and 80s, using them for wolf control as settlement expanded into previously wild territories. The construction details varied based on individual skill and available materials, but the core principles remained consistent. Dig deep with vertical walls, create a collapsing snow bridge, position along animal travel routes, and wait for gravity to do the work. The method was eventually attributed to old Scandinavian hunting techniques, a vague historical connection that erased individual innovation in favor of cultural tradition. No records credited Torsten Lindgren specifically. His name faded from memory as the men who had known him died or moved away. Physical evidence remained longer than memory. Abandoned pits, their rectangular shape still visible as depressions in forest clearings, marked locations where the technique had been employed decades earlier. Even into the early 1900s, ranchers and hunters occasionally discovered these remnants, rectangular holes with vertical sides that seemed too precisely constructed to be natural, their original purpose forgotten, but their engineering still evident to anyone who looked carefully.